Yeah. All right. Welcome to the Antedote. This is Greg McCarran.
This is Jeremy Rothkushel.
Jeremy, it is Monday, June 30th, and well, yeah, since last time we've talked, a lot has happened, and I know before we try to get into all the craziness, I know you've you've been on. I don't know. You've seen some interesting things. Traveled to Europe and seen some things. You wanna? I guess we could talk a little bit about that, and then also just get into some of the recent stuff that's happened during your month gone. But yeah, things that have given us hope, and then also things that have given us a lot of dread. I know you were traveling. I got to go to the local No Kings protest in Waterloo, Iowa, and I came out of that with positive thoughts. Yeah, so just a lot to talk about. But Jeremy, what are your basic feelings coming off of following things that have been happening and just getting back into the swing of things?
It was very interesting to travel in Europe with my family. I hadn't been as an adult. I went to Spain one time as an exchange, kind of an exchange student with a family in high school. And this time we went to Norway, which was just very beautiful and a real, I don't know, a very maturing kind of country, very I don't know, very cool in general, and lots of water and wonderful water quality and air quality and natural beauty. And there was a lot going on at the time in terms of there was an ongoing protest outside of the Israeli, I don't know if it was a consulate, it was on this embassy row area. And Norway has a very interesting history politically in terms of having been very strong at one point and Vikings and doing raids and all that kind of thing, and then sort of getting taken over by foreign elements in terms of Danish and Swedish elements, and now beginning to forge their own economic future and having certain wise bureaucrats in their government who set forth things like these massive investments or national natural endowments in terms of their when they discovered oil off their coast there, and making sure that was a lot of those resources in terms of financial were being fed into their national system for everybody to benefit from over the long term. uh, and then went to Paris for a week, which was also very interesting. Um, Not so much my vibes, but very high quality food actually for not that. It was way less expensive in the grocery stores for the level of quality of food compared to the United States. You could have fresh squeezed orange juice that was made by like the machine in the moment for probably half the price that you would have to pay for something like that in the United States, and high quality, like pate for $2, something like that, €2, in the grocery store. So real nutrient dense food and a very vibrant street culture and people walking a lot. And then finished up in Amsterdam, which also had a lot beginning to go on in that area. There was soon to be they were starting to celebrate their 750th anniversary as a city, almost as a city state, really. And then the day we left, out of Schiphol Airport, which is supposedly there's these infamous stories about how it was given a difficult name so that during wartime the spies could actually be identified by how they pronounced it. But there were folks beginning to sort of trickle in terms of the NATO summit at the Hague, which is sort of close to Amsterdam, within around a half hour to an hour drive from Amsterdam. And then I saw the B-2 bombers leave Missouri just as we were beginning to get going that morning. And I was watching them. And I got faked out I guess they ran a whole decoy crew from Missouri through Kansas to the west and filling up with tankers mid-flight and over Kansas. And it looks like those that headed toward the Pacific were actually a decoy, while the actual strategic mission B-2s were heading directly to Iran to target the three nuclear sites. So that was sort of wild to observe that going down as we were coming back to the United States. And then I guess the final thing I would say is that it was actually very, very smooth when we came back into the country in terms of, uh, you know, uh, immigration and customs. And it was actually the smoothest I've ever seen. It was sort of almost totally empty. And I think our, Latino officer was very friendly, welcomed us back to the country, and didn't press us on anything. And and then as I was, as we were flying back from Boston Logan Airport, which was interesting too to see, they have very prominently, they have this 9/11 memorial marked at the Logan Airport in Boston, which of course is, the site of 9/11 flights. That was still being, it was like being pushed really intensely, like it was, you should go here immediately from the Logan Airport. And I was reading an article about Australian young journalists who were being totally mistreated by immigration and customs in the United States, going through their phones and private life, and all about how they wrote about the protests at Columbia, and really wild stories that people who are not citizens are experiencing in relationship to the United States. I now get a sense of like the setup between these different kinds of classes of individuals. That seems a crucial piece of the framing of this political moment of, of being a natural born citizen. And now, of course, that is now a question. It just came up in the Supreme Court. Actually, not that question specifically. The Trump people found a really wily way around that question and actually were able to get the Supreme Court to sign off on standing down lower courts from ever doing national injunctions, basically, against any executive kind of branch declarations, and that everything had to be happen at almost like at the regional or circuit kind of federal level before uh, it could progress on up to the Supreme Court. But I just get the sense of like the haves and the have-nots are people are we're being funneled into understanding our privilege and taking our privilege seriously as maybe citizens of the United States who are not under the kind of threat that some might be at this point. And then that, of course, is then filtered into the haves and the have-nots around the big BS bill, and it being framed as an assault on fraud in terms of I think it's Medicaid, that they are going to make it much more difficult for people to stay on and really ramp up work requirements and push the age level up to like 65. And all these kinds of things are, you have then people repeating these talking points about how there's all these fraudsters and these lazy people who don't want to work, and we're not them, and they're the cause of our American slump, and those kinds of things. So
Yeah, that was I told you about the phone call when I was in Kansas City. I joined a couple months back. I got a call from a virtual town hall that Representative Ashley Henson, who's the representative in Congress for the area of Iowa, Waterloo, Iowa area, and was mentioning at one point, and it started off by, she's on, I guess, the Doge subcommittee, and was naming off a bunch of things like, funding transgender operas with USAID, and then goes on with, I think what a lot of the people are saying with regards to that is, Medicaid's for people who need it, not for able-bodied men who are sitting around, in their parents' home playing video games or whatever. But I mean, even I can say from and it's not one size fits all, but I can tell you from my personal experience with my family, that's an extremely narrow-minded and unfair way to look at things in the case, of my own father who has a permanent brain injury, and his, it's always affected his ability to work and to function as far as the way that, as far as how he functions and operates in society. So I can tell you at the very least that is extremely narrow-minded way, to say the least, to look at things. But so it's, to say the least, but there's also any kind of real problems there are with the system, and just ultimately it just seems to be another way to just punish people who, for whatever reason, need have needed and rely on, for varying reasons, a leg up for things, and then ultimately just lumping in people who the wholesale excuse of the able-bodied male or whatever, it ultimately just lumps in a lot of cases where there's mental health and other things going on that can't be seen. So, it just seems like it's another way to just punish people. That's a lot of what it comes down to. And then also the kind of people who don't like the idea of a safety net and on all of this. So, and it's certainly not that simple, but this is a big part of it. And I can say from personal experience that part of the whole narrative around the Medicaid fraud and all of this, and then here it is. Well, you're just applying it to the able-bodied men, because no one's going to feel bad for an able-bodied man who isn't working, So it's I can say that. But that's interesting, because this brings me to thinking about my experience at the Waterloo Iowa No Kings protest, and there were a lot of people there for a lot of reasons, and Medicaid was among the reasons. All kinds of different reasons people were there, from geopolitics to local government issues, and the issue, of course, of the social safety net and leaving it alone, especially as people continue to just benefit from this bill at the highest levels, as always seems to go with these kinds of trends with administrations like this. But so I went to the No Kings rally. It was in downtown Waterloo, Iowa. It was Saturday, June 14th, and I think there were hundreds of people there. I don't know if it was quite 1,000, but and also this was my first time being to an actual major organized protest, because my previous experience with protests, Jeremy, I was telling you about this, were things like the a Kansas City end of the Fed rally outside of the Federal Reserve headquarters in Kansas City, which maybe had 3 dozen people, back in 2013 or 14. So I hadn't been to any really major active protests like this. I was too young, obviously, for the anti-war protests. I didn't really get into the local Occupy movement. I was in a different place in my life at that point. Actually, I was Ron Paul, so those kind of interests converged but didn't converge. But anyway, this was my first major protest, and I came away from it pretty heartened. I had sent you a bunch of pictures of some of the signs from the event, and all kinds of people seeing boomer age people, seeing veterans, people who had signs talking about how, I fought, I didn't fight I think I saw a sign of, my father didn't fight World War II for a king to take over the country and all this. And so very heartened by a lot of the presence at this. And while it wasn't, I'm sure it wasn't like the protest in Kansas City, which would have been much bigger than this, I still came away from it pretty heartened. And I think if you were to just look at the Waterloo protest, which really went down without a hitch, it really, especially in a state like Iowa, which is very, very large white majority, you definitely do not come away with the way that the media portrays it as just a bunch of. So it really flies in the face of that, of the idea, not just of the idea that these protests are just like a criminal element or whatever, but even the demographics of the protests. And it was just, it was hundreds upon hundreds of people who were seriously concerned with the way things are going in their country, with all kinds of issues, from domestic issues related to size of government, to geopolitics, to there were people there on behalf of for immigration, for immigrants' rights, and then even the man with the Wounded Warrior Project hat, who described himself as a strict constitutionalist who's dismayed by things like the ordering of the military in the streets. So yeah, it was much like you came away from elements of the whole trip to Europe, I came away heartened to a good extent from the from experiencing the No Kings protest in Waterloo. And it's certainly not perfect. Obviously, it's not what we would want it to be in every area, but it's I think it's very heartening. I was heartened to see the level of protest, the diversity in terms of the types of things people were protesting and coming together with a common message, basically, that what's happening in the country right now is unacceptable.
Yes, and I mean, there's this, this. I think that what we experience here in the Midwest is what in a Kansan context, right? They call prairie populism of some sort, which is or prairie progressivism, some people might call it, and it's both. And I think that extends, around the area, especially in terms of somewhere like Iowa, where it's especially amongst the older generations, like who still have a sense of where the what the country used to be in terms of its civic commitments in a way, and before the normalization of certain, and I would say very anti-American kinds of talking points and narrative warfare that we've been talking about for the last decade. Uh, so there is that, and I since I've been back, I've gone to a couple different events here in Lawrence to just check in to see what what would have been called during Trump one, the resistance, or that comes from the progressive liberals and the left, and see what's going on with them. And one was there's a new organization in Kansas called Leading Kansas that seems to be sort of the standard, it's fairly might be called centrist, progressive, liberal, constitutionalists. Did a panel at the KU Student Union, their big theater there, and they sort of had some of the local constitutional law professors who would answer questions about the the apparent right of American executives to engage in certain kinds of attacks, like the Trump's Iran attacks, without actually getting congressional approval, and how that's been basically de facto the norm at the very least since at least World War II. Something we've talked about a lot, and you can make parallels between the Russian coding of their obvious, it's a war, it's an invasion of their neighboring country, and they of course call it a special military operation, which begins to sound like the way that a lot of late 20th and 21st century American foreign policy war history has been coded: police actions, special actions, executive actions, these kinds of things. And so I also got the it wasn't a big I haven't been to any of I missed the big protests, but the sort of and no kings protests. And I spoke with my father while we were observing that they were coming, and as things in Los Angeles were getting chaotic with the sort of calling in of National Guard and Trump stationing Marines in LA and all of that, about how there's this aspect of the way that the idea of the king, Trump as the king, is coded and messaged to the progressives, the liberals, the left, and that it really, almost to me, it seems like another evasion of reality and deep politics in a way, and that it's way more that he is a mob boss and not a king, and that the whole thing is being coded and given narrative, cover by the right, by the sort of Curtis Yarvin types on the right, as that we need a king. So that they argue for the legitimacy of something more like an autocracy and a monarchy, that democracy has shown itself to be unable to grapple with the current moment. And so coding it as a king, to me, actually sort of plays into the hands of trying to run cover for that. This is like more deep politics. This is mob takeover. This is vicious, vampiric, oligarch asset stripping going on, rather than something like a king. Because you can have a king who's benevolent, you could have a king who's nasty, a king who's potentially owned by foreign interests or subversive interests from within, that kind of thing. But it's more of an argument about a form of government. And if we're going to have that argument, then we're going to then have to deal with the unitary executive and how this has been a long running scenario, just like these constitutional law professors pointed out at KU, of that every president, pretty much Democrat, Republican, whether they saw themselves as some kind of king or not, they embrace this kind of executive power, especially in terms of military action. And on through like the war on terror era, post 9/11, and the creation of Guantanamo and enemy combatants as terminology, and then Obama then taking the power to be able to consider due process, some kind of private meeting in the executive office about a kill matrix that would then actually end up ending the lives of American citizens abroad, and that kind of thing. And so that feels like an intellectual slippery slope away again from deep politics. And then I'll just finish up by saying the other thing that, well, I am heartened by the fact that there is this older generation, really, that you were describing, who showed up in numbers and whose hearts are clearly still in the American game to some extent. That the strategy and the mindset and the leadership, really, the public intellectual leadership of the liberal progressives and the left has led them into a blind alley, basically a dead end, I think. And I noticed this also at the more left-oriented community meeting, where it was all the usual kinds of groups that you would say were, well, we're going to take this moment as a moment to organize and be good allies. And I just didn't see any deeper or higher thinking strategic wisdom on the part of both the younger and the older generations in terms of this. And then this was then all brought together at this leading Kansas forum, where a middle-aged man in the audience asked a question about that there are conspiracies to commit election fraud. And he started talking about, I think it was Wisconsin, and evidence that had come up in terms of the last election, and how it looked like there was substantial evidence for election fraud being perpetrated. And the head of ACLU Kansas, Micah Kubik, who I've been through this again with him maybe 6-7 years ago, in terms of a big event that they did at the Dole at the Lead Center near the Dole Institute in Lawrence, Kansas, where basically trying to write it all off as he knows a lot of election workers and they are of good faith, and any kind of conspiracy would have to involve 100,000 good faith election workers. And so I still feel like we're in like 2005 or something like that, after the 2004 election, after the 9/11 and the deceptive launching of the Iraq War, and the apparent stealing of the 2004 election, where the people who should be actually thought leaders and engaging in courageous, clarifying speech are mainly giving a lot of heat. That's his speech was very sort of southern and a lot of fire, but almost no clarification other than basically, okay, this is we're here, we're going to be pursuing some cases, some class action lawsuits to deal with what the Supreme Court did, but don't you worry about elections. We have election integrity. We just have to make sure that the Republicans can't suppress the vote. So I feel like we're just repeating the same kind of creation of the vacuum, the deep political vacuum that helped manufacture this Trump MAGA movement in the first place by allowing them to steal terms like the deep state, by allowing them to basically totally reverse 180 reversals on things like election fraud and making accusations with no facts, while it apparently to me they were the ones who were engaged in very likely election fraud. And none of the leading Kansas lights will say anything about it and will tamp down evidence-based questions from actual Kansans who have information on their hands. So there's this aspect that to me that is disconcerting, that we at the very least in terms of this very public level of when you see these big protests and they're designed around no kings, or these state level new groups that are coming in to wrestle with the danger of the moment, they're not up to the task either in terms of strategy or in terms of understanding or messaging. So that's my bit of concern right now.
No, I think that's extremely valid. And let's remember that in happier times before Elon Musk tweeted about, my God, in the events of June, we forget that we started the month with Elon Musk asserting that Donald Trump is on the Epstein, is in the Epstein, is on, is in the Epstein laws, and that's why they haven't been released in all of this. But in happier times, Elon Musk did pretty publicly within plain sight try to buy the Wisconsin Supreme Court election. I mean, what he gave, given money to people who would vote in favor of it. I think he awarded a Turning Point USA person with $1 million for supporting his candidate in that election. So, I mean, yeah, it's certainly not far-fetched. That's an example where, almost got away with in plain sight basically trying to buy an election, much less all of this election fraud stuff that you bring up. But none of these people within, like, these organized, maybe more progressive sphere type of organizations and interests do not want to deal with and have not dealt with in any significant way, whereas you could make an argument, it does look like at least every GOP presidential election victory of the 21st century has had different levels of chicanery to it, yet nobody deals with it.
It's a good point, and maybe we should wrap up for this time around. But people called it Elon's nuclear option when he dropped the tweet about Trump and Epstein and all of that. But of course, that was it is a nuclear option of some sort. But I'd call it the tactical, covert nuclear option. Too little, too late. And whereas the real nuclear option would be like, Elon knows where the election fraud bodies might be buried, and that would actually be it. And then one other thing I might want to return to from my European encounters was the learning about the deep political history while I was in Paris of this key 20th century. They call him, he's an intellectual, but he was also ended up serving at the highest levels of the French government. Alexander Kojev was his, a Europeanized name. He was, Russian, and then it came out that he was a long-term Soviet spy, was a key element of the creation of what becomes the European Union, and looked like a lot of what he was involved in at the level of the French government and its interfacing with European and American allies was to actually try to separate. Same thing we're seeing now in terms of the Russian sphere's interests of trying to cleave off, certain parts of Europe from sort of closer towards Russia and away from, would now be disparaged as the Atlanticists or the Anglo-American imperialists or something like that. So maybe we could return to that in the future too.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, there's a lot to talk about in terms of the events of the last month or so. But it's good to catch up and reflect on like what we've been doing in the last month and how it does intertwine with the things, with the important events that have been taking place going on as we get into the long hot summer here in the Midwestern United States, both domestically and internationally and geopolitically, as we always focus on.
All right. Well, it's good to catch back up, Greg. And so until our next dispatch, goodbye.
All right.